Somewhere, right now, there is a glass of wine sitting on a table. Maybe it is in a restaurant in Paris. Maybe it is in a small kitchen in Argentina. Maybe it is on a wooden table outside a farmhouse in Italy, catching the last light of the afternoon sun. That glass looks simple, ordinary even. But inside it is something that has traveled 8,000 years to reach this moment. Inside that glass is an accident, a forgotten jar, a monk's mistake, a disease that nearly destroyed everything, a competition that changed the world. If you have ever held a glass of wine, or even if you have simply seen one, you have been closer to one of the longest stories in human history than you ever realized. This is Calm English Stories. Find a comfortable place. Let your shoulders drop, and let this story come to you slowly and gently. It has been waiting a very long time to be told. Let us go back, far back, further than Rome, further than Egypt, further than writing, further than wheels, further than almost anything we think of when we think of civilization. 8,000 years ago, the region we now call Georgia in the South Caucasus. Mountains covered in wild plants, small communities of people living close to the land, close to the seasons, close to the rhythms of nature. They gathered fruits, they crushed them. They stored the juice in containers made from clay. Nobody was trying to make wine. The concept did not exist. They were simply trying to preserve food, to save something for the days when food would be harder to find. And then, as so many of the most important moments in human history, something happened by accident. A clay jar of grape juice was set aside and forgotten. Perhaps the person who stored it became ill. Perhaps they moved. Perhaps they simply had other things to think about. The jar sat there, undisturbed, while the world continued around it. But inside the jar, something extraordinary was taking place. Microscopic organisms, wild yeasts invisible to the eye, floated in from the surrounding air and settled into the juice. They began to feed on the natural sugars. They produced carbon dioxide. They produced something else, a small amount of alcohol. The juice transformed. It became something new, something that had never existed before in that form. When someone finally opened that jar and took a careful taste, the flavor was unlike anything they had expected. It was richer, warmer. It carried a complexity that simple grape juice never had. And the feeling it produced in the body was gentle and unfamiliar. No ancient record tells us the name of the person who took that first sip. But whoever they were, they understood immediately that this was worth keeping, worth repeating, worth sharing. In 2017, a team of scientists working in Georgia uncovered what they believe to be the oldest winemaking site ever found. Clay vessels, still bearing the chemical traces of ancient wine, dating back 6,000 years. The jars had been buried in the earth, used as natural temperature regulators, keeping the liquid cool and stable. What makes this discovery truly remarkable is not just its age, it is the continuity. In parts of Georgia today, winemakers still bury clay vessels in the ground, still use the same ancient technique. The method survived not because anyone decided to preserve it, but because it worked, because it was good, because generation after generation looked at what their parents had done and saw no reason to change it. 8,000 years, and the jar is still there. Wine moved, as humans moved, as trading routes opened, As boats carried goods from one shore to another, wine traveled with them. It arrived in Egypt. Egypt was a civilization built on control. Control of water, control of grain, control of time itself, through the measurement of the flooding Nile. The Egyptians took wine and placed it within their understanding of the world. They gave it a god. His name was Osiris. He was one of the most important figures in Egyptian belief. The god connected to life, death, and the world between them. According to Egyptian tradition, it was Osiris who first showed humanity how to grow grapes and press them into wine. The drink was not simply pleasurable, it was sacred. It was a thread connecting the living to the divine. When pharaohs were prepared for burial, wine was among the most important things placed with them. Not 1 or 2 jars, hundreds, carefully sealed. Carefully labeled with information about the origin of the grapes, the year of the harvest, and sometimes the name of the winemaker. These labels were among the earliest examples of something we would now recognize as wine records. Organized, systematic notes about where a wine came from and how it was made. In 2004, researchers examining the contents of tomb vessels discovered something that stopped them completely. Inside one of the jars, more than 3,000 years old, they found evidence of a blended wine, juice from grapes grown in multiple different regions, combined to create a single, more complex drink. The Egyptians were not simply drinking wine, they were composing it, thinking about it, making deliberate choices about how one flavor could balance or enhance another. This is not the picture most of us carry of ancient Egypt. We think of monuments and hieroglyphs and the golden masks of pharaohs. But here, in the quiet chemistry of a sealed clay jar, is something more intimate. A person who cared deeply about the experience of drinking, a person who thought, this wine could be better. Let me try something. That instinct, the desire to improve, to refine, to compose, is still at the center of winemaking today, thousands of years after that jar was sealed. Wine found its greatest early expansion through one of history's most organized forces, the Roman Empire. Rome was not subtle about the things it valued. It valued order. It valued military strength. It valued infrastructure. And it valued wine. Wine was part of daily Roman life at every level of society. Soldiers received it as part of their regular provisions. It was served at dinners, offered at religious ceremonies, traded as a commodity across the length and breadth of the empire. When Roman legions marched into new territories, north into Gaul, west into Iberia, across the narrow water into Britain, they brought their habits with them. And one of those habits was wine. Not just the drinking of it, but the growing of it. Roman settlers planted vineyards across the territories they occupied. They looked for hillsides that caught the right amount of sun. They tested the soil. They shared what they learned with the people already living there. The regions those early Roman planters chose were not random. They had a good eye for land. The places where they planted their vines in France, in Spain, in parts of Germany, those same places are still considered among the finest wine-growing regions on Earth today. The names Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the valleys of the Rhine carry within them a memory of those first Roman vineyards, planted by soldiers who were far from home and wanted something familiar to drink. There is a moment worth pausing on here. An emperor named Domitian, troubled by competition from the provinces, issued a decree forbidding the planting of new vineyards outside of Italy. He wanted to protect the home industry, to keep Italian wine at the center of the empire's economy. The law was enforced for a time. But laws cannot stop growing things. In the countryside of what is now France, small vineyards continued quietly. Farmers found ways around the rules. The vines kept going into the ground. No empire lasts forever. And when Rome eventually weakened, when the roads broke and the cities emptied and the long order of Roman civilization began to unravel, the vineyards suffered too. In the cold northern regions of Europe, without Roman demand to sustain them, many vineyards were simply abandoned. The grapes grew wild or disappeared entirely. For a period of around 2 centuries, wine in much of northern Europe was something people remembered rather than something they drank. And yet, wine did not die. In the hills of medieval Europe, tucked away from the noise of wars and the collapse of old powers, there were small stone buildings surrounded by vegetable gardens and quiet corridors. These were monasteries, and the people inside them needed wine for a specific, daily, non-negotiable reason. Christian religious practice required wine. The ritual of communion, one of the most central acts of Christian worship, involved bread and wine as symbols of profound significance. Without wine, the ceremony could not take place. Without the ceremony, the community of faith had a serious problem. The monks, faced with this need, did what practical, dedicated people do. They solved it. They planted vines in places where no one had tried before. They experimented in cold climates, on north-facing hillsides, in regions where the growing season was short and unpredictable. And because they were patient, methodical, and deeply organized, the records they kept, year after year, of which plots of land produced which results, they slowly built up an extraordinary body of knowledge about where grapes could grow and how to coax them into producing something worth drinking. The monks effectively became the first serious agricultural scientists of the wine world, not because they had planned to, but because necessity had pointed them in that direction. Their cellars, cool and quiet beneath the stone buildings, became places of careful, slow work, tasting, testing, adjusting. One abbey in France, a place connected to a monk named Dom Pérignon, became the site of a discovery that the monk himself initially considered a catastrophe. The climate in the Champagne region of northern France is challenging for grapes. The winters arrive early and stay long. One year, Dom Pérignon prepared his wine in autumn as usual, but the cold set in before the fermentation was complete. The wine went into bottles still holding active yeasts. When spring arrived and the temperature rose, those yeasts woke up and continued working. The result was enormous pressure building inside the sealed glass bottles. The bottles began to explode. One after another, in the darkness of the cellar, the pressure became too much. Dom Pérignon reportedly described the sound as something terrifying, a series of small explosions destroying months of careful work. He tried everything he knew to prevent it. He could not. So, with the pragmatic creativity that defines so many moments of human discovery, he shifted his approach. Instead of eliminating the bubbles, he studied them. He learned to manage the pressure, to select stronger glass, to use a cork that could hold without shattering. He turned his failure into something consistent and controllable. The drink that emerged from that cold cellar, and those exploding bottles was not what Dom Pérignon had been trying to make. But it was, as the world would come to discover, something rather wonderful. We call it champagne today, served at celebrations, at weddings, at moments of arrival and achievement across the world. Its origin was a monk standing in a cold cellar, looking at broken glass on the floor, deciding to try again. The 19th century brought science and industry to winemaking. Better tools, better understanding of fermentation, better transportation to carry wine across greater distances. The wine world was expanding, confident, and connected. And then a tiny creature arrived from across the Atlantic Ocean and quietly began to destroy it. Phylloxera was a louse, an insect so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye. It had lived alongside American grapevines for thousands of years. American vines had developed, over that long period, a natural resistance to the insect. It did not particularly harm them. But when Phylloxera arrived in Europe, carried accidentally on botanical specimens brought from America sometime in the 1860s, it encountered European vines that had no such defense. European grapes had never met this creature before. They had no answer for it. The louse attached itself to the roots of the vines and fed on them. Slowly, quietly, below the surface of the soil, where no one could easily see, the roots weakened and died. Above ground, the vines yellowed, drooped, and stopped producing fruit. By the time most growers understood what was happening, entire vineyards had been lost. The damage was immense. Across France, across Italy, across Spain, across Germany. More than half of all the vineyard land in Europe was eventually affected. Families who had grown grapes on the same hillside for 10 generations watched their plants die without understanding why. The wine trade, which had built entire regional economies, contracted sharply. For years, no one had an answer. The solution, when it came, was strange and counterintuitive. American vines were resistant to phylloxera. So, the idea went, what if you used American vine roots and grafted European grape varieties onto them? The root would resist the louse. The upper part of the plant would still produce the European grape, the flavor, the tradition, the regional character. All of this could theoretically be preserved. It worked. It was not a perfect solution. It was complicated and labor-intensive, but it saved European winemaking. Virtually every European vineyard replanted after the phylloxera crisis was built on this grafted model, a European top on American roots. The plants that grow in the great French chateau today, the plants that produce the wines sold for extraordinary prices in the finest restaurants in the world. They are all, in a botanical sense, part American. When you drink a glass of wine from Bordeaux or Tuscany, you are drinking the product of a plant that only exists because of a disaster and because people found a way through it. For centuries, the assumption was simple and broadly held. The best wine in the world came from France, perhaps also from parts of Italy or Spain, but primarily France. The French regions had centuries of tradition behind them, the finest techniques, the most respected names. To challenge this was not simply to make a different preference. It was to misunderstand the nature of wine itself. That assumption lasted until a single afternoon in Paris in the year 1976. A British wine merchant named Stephen Spurrier had a straightforward idea: organize a blind tasting, where expert judges tasted wines without knowing which country they came from, and see what happened. He invited some of France's most respected wine critics and judges. He prepared 2 sets of wines, French wines and wines from California, which had a small but growing wine industry. The judges tasted everything carefully. They made their notes, they gave their scores. They assumed, reasonably enough, that the French wines would rise naturally to the top. When the results were announced, the room was very quiet. The wine that received the highest score in the red category was a Cabernet Sauvignon from the Napa Valley in California. The white wine category was won by a Chardonnay from a California winery that many of the judges had never heard of. French wines, which the judges had assumed they were ranking highest, turned out in several cases to have been the California bottles all along. The event became known as the Judgment of Paris, a reference layered with the kind of irony that history occasionally produces. The city that had considered itself the capital of wine had just hosted the moment when wine's world became much larger. The Judgment of Paris opened a door that had long been assumed closed. If California could produce wine of this quality, what about Argentina? What about Chile? What about South Africa, or Australia, or New Zealand? Over the following decades, wine regions all over the world invested, experimented, and began producing bottles that found their way onto tables far from home. Today, wine comes from over 50 countries. China is among the growing wine producers. India is developing its wine regions. England, cold, gray, frequently rainy England, is producing sparkling wines of genuine quality, some of which compete seriously in international tastings. The world of wine has expanded in ways that would have seemed impossible to any expert sitting in that Paris room in 1976. We have traveled a long way together in this story, from a forgotten clay jar in the mountains of ancient Georgia, all the way to a modern bottle on a table somewhere in the world tonight. What does that journey teach us? Wine survived because people kept choosing to save it. The monks who planted vines in cold and difficult places were not making a business decision. They were making an act of faith in the tradition, in the value of the thing, in the belief that something worth preserving is worth the effort. The farmers who grafted their dying European vines onto American roots were doing the same thing. Choosing not to give up, choosing to find the path through. Every single glass of wine that exists today is connected to that chain of human decision. To keep going, to try again, to find the solution that nobody has found yet. There is something else wine teaches, something quieter. Wine is one of the few things made by humans that genuinely improves with time. Many things in the modern world are designed for speed, for convenience, for immediate satisfaction. Wine moves in the opposite direction. A great bottle of wine from a difficult harvest, stored properly for 10 or 20 years, can become something far richer and more complex than it was when it was bottled. The waiting is part of the process. The patience is not just acceptable, it is necessary. That is a different kind of lesson, one worth sitting with. The next time you see a glass of wine, whether you are the kind of person who drinks it or not, let yourself pause for just a moment. That glass holds 8,000 years. It holds an accident in a clay jar, and the curiosity of whoever first tasted what the accident had made. It holds the reverence of Egyptian priests and the practicality of Roman soldiers. It holds the patience of monks in cold stone cellars, keeping something alive that the world had nearly forgotten. It holds the grief of farmers watching their vines die, and the stubborn ingenuity that brought the vines back. It holds a monk standing in a cellar full of broken bottles, deciding, despite everything, to try again. And it holds that quiet afternoon in Paris, when the door opened and the whole world walked through it. All of that is in a single glass. Ordinary and extraordinary at exactly the same time. This is what history does, if we let it in. It turns the familiar into something we can truly see. It gives the everyday things around us their proper weight and their proper wonder. Thank you for being here with Calm English Stories today. You stayed with this story from the beginning to the end, and that takes a kind of patience that this story would very much approve of. If something in this episode surprised you or stayed with you, the ancient Georgian jars, the exploding bottles in Dom Perignon's cellar, the tiny insect that almost ended European wine, please share it in the comments. Your words make this community real, and every comment is genuinely read and appreciated. If you are learning English through these stories, know that every minute you spend listening is doing something real for your understanding and your confidence. Slow, steady, patient, just like wine. Subscribe to Calm English Stories, so the next story is always waiting when you are ready. And until then, move slowly, listen well, and remember that some of the most important things in life were accidents that someone chose to keep.